Well, hey, good morning. This is Robin and Dave.
Hi.
And we have quite an elaborate setup here, from a three-legged table held up by the tire of our car to the sun behind us and cars going by. We've driven out of the wilderness where we're camping with some friends into Cascade, Idaho. So you might hear an occasional vehicle go by. We're in front of the library where they have free internet. And this is where actually we've been coming here every day because we're on a working vacation where we're coming in every day to do coaching, to do work, and then we are enjoying this pristine wilderness lake. It's called Horse Thief Reservoir, where we're camping in our little mini camper with some friends, paddle boarding, riding bikes, cooking, doing all the wilderness stuff. And so we're just grateful that we could find a way to be with you this morning.
It really is God's providence that this is all working out, because we didn't have enough battery in the phone, but thankfully I had my battery backup in my briefcase, and just a lot of things had to come together. But we felt the Spirit calling us. We felt the Spirit calling us into the wilderness earlier this week to go up here. But this morning we felt the Spirit calling us out of the wilderness to talk about our wilderness experience and to talk about what it means to have spiritual, live in that spiritual wilderness, what the wilderness means in the scriptures, and how significant it can be in our lives, and how significant it was even in the life of Christ.
Yeah, I've been reading, I like to take books on wilderness into the wilderness, and this is called The Solace of Fierce Landscapes. Actually, Belden C. Lane is one of my favorite spiritual writers. We need you over just a little bit towards me. There we go, try to get Dave into the picture here more. My favorite thing to do when we're in a really wild place is to, late at night, we have a tiny camper, which is basically a bed on wheels, and to scrunch up in there with a lantern and to read a book about wilderness spirituality. And the thing, I'm realizing is the wilderness is wild. Yesterday, my friend Dina said to me that, Robin, as much as you love the wilderness always bites you. And sure enough, I'm 36 hours into a spider bite, and I know some of you are groaning because you know me and you know that's what happens, but this was a bad one. I had the camp host look at it, who had on her mask for coronavirus. I had the camp host look at it, and she said it looks like a venomous spider bite, and it started burning and itching and a big red ring around it. And I've been putting every homeopathic remedy I have in my little first aid kit I carry everywhere on it. But that bite has kind of once again brought me to my knees, like just the pain of it, just, oh no, how could this have happened? Another venomous spider bite, and the possibility of blood poisoning. All of our campmates were like, you have to go. We might be going by urgent care this morning and having them take a look. And that's how the wilderness is. But what I told, and that's an ATV going by, so welcome to wilderness living. But I told Dina, here's the thing. I am not giving up the joy of the wilderness for its bite. And I think that's what we're tempted to do in Christianity. I've been talking to Dave about, are we trying to domesticate discipleship? In other words, do we want it all neat and pretty? Do we want people to fit into neat categories, and we want their pain to be neat? We want their repentance to be neat. We want the way they function in the body to be orderly. Are we trying to domesticate discipleship by cutting the wildness out of it? And the more we're here, the more I'm thinking that wildness is an essential part of spirituality.
Well, certainly there's things that you see and experience that...
Here, come in for one more bit here. Still trying to get Dave more in the picture here. You're gonna have to lean in.
Things you can experience in the wild that you just don't get in the city. There are, while Robin's nestling in her, in the camper with her book, I'm nestling into my chair next to the campfire I built underneath the stars. And there's something about being underneath the stars on a moonless night that is an experience like no other. And I think definitely when you're out here, there are no lights, there's no light pollution. We're far away from anything that could take away from the grandeur and the beauty of God's creation as we see it in the stars. And something about that affects my heart, and we'll talk more about it a little bit later. But to me, that's the joy of the wilderness, is being away from everything that can cloud your view of God's creation and experience God in a very special way.
Yeah, one moment for me that makes the bite worth it was being out on my paddleboard on just a glassy water with the mountains reflected into the water. And there were eagles flying over. In fact, there was an epic situation yesterday where an osprey was flying with a fish and a bald eagle chasing it to get the fish away from the osprey. You know, there's epic moments that happen out here, but out there on my paddleboard on a clear water, and I was praying. I was praying for the women that I coach. I was praying for the couples we're working with. I was praying for our ministry. I was just in this sheer solitude and magnificent. The water was carrying me. I could hear birds calling, and I could hear the bugs. You know, if you get into the marsh, you can see all kinds of birds. And it's like the wilderness has so many gifts to have, but we have to take the bite of it. And I have this sense that God is calling us wilder. You know, I know we're missing a to be there, but I think he's calling us wilder. And even the word bewilderment, which can either be used negatively or positively. Bewilderment can be like an awe, but it can also be like a confusion. Man, that kind of sums up nature, I think. Awe and confusion, but also wilderness spirituality. There's awe and there's confusion. There's beauty, but then there's moments where like, why? What? You gotta be kidding. No, this can't be. Why? Why me? You know, or there's moments of danger even. And then there's moments of relief and grace that, oh my gosh, God delivered us from the danger. And I think it's such an apt illustration. It's no wonder that God often called his people into the wilderness.
Right. Even that word itself, we could pronounce it wilderness instead of wilderness.
Wilderness. I like that. Wilderness.
At the root of wilderness is the wild and the call of the wild. And you think about the scriptures, when God wants to teach his people something, he calls them into the wilderness. Whether it was the 40 years of desert wandering in the wilderness for God's people of Israel, whether it was Jesus in his 40-day fast in the wilderness, starting his ministry, whether it was Abraham, who was called to leave the comforts of Ur and a modern city environment to go to a country he didn't know, but it was also a wilderness location that God had in mind for Abraham. And that's how he built Abraham's faith to be the father of faith, was in the wilderness.
You know, it's interesting, the word bewilderment. Oh, honey, it just turned. I don't know if it turned for the people too. Just a second, guys. This is wilderness Facebook Live. Yesterday, now it's just showing me. So you're gonna have to come way over. Bear with us, please. Over. No more. You're gonna have to get way over. Okay, and lean in. All right, here we are again. I broke our stand that holds the phone, so we've got it pieced together with duct tape, and that's how much we wanted to be with you guys today. But that term bewilderment has a plea in it: be wilder. And I have this sense that God is saying to me, Robin, be wilder. You know, trust me in the wildness of your faith. trust me in the wildness of your experience. And really moving into the wildness of our faith is so redemptive. I'm going to try one more thing, guys, to see if this will help it. I don't know, Dave. We are having troubles here with how this is holding together. There we go. All right, lean in a little and we'll be good. I want to read you a quote from this book, because you can't see yourself.
Looking fine.
Okay, good. So, thank you. This is messy, and let me tell you, camping is messy. Everything about camping is messy, and so here's messy Facebook Live for you. Be Wilder Facebook Live. He says, the God of Sinai is one who thrives on fierce landscapes. Again, this is from The Solace of Fierce Landscapes by Belden C. Lane, page 43. The God of Sinai is one who thrives on fierce landscapes, seemingly forcing God's people into wild and wretched climates where trust must be absolute. And then he explains in Exodus 13:17, it says, the text affirms in most usual English translation that when Pharaoh let the people of Israel go, Yahweh did not lead them by way of the land of Philistines, although that would have been closer. They were not taken along the Mediterranean and into Palestine by the easier, more direct route to the north. Instead, they were pointed toward a longer route, further south, more deeply into the desert, toward Mount Sinai. The argument of the rabbis hinged on how the Hebrew word ki should be understood in this passage. Usually the term is taken to mean that God chose not to lead the Israelites by the northern route, although it was the shorter, less troublesome way. Yet ki can also be translated because, suggesting something far more provocative. If this is the meaning, then God decided against the shorter route because, for the very reason that it was easier and less demanding. God intentionally opted for the more difficult landscape, as if this were habitually the divine preference. God's people are deliberately forced into the desert, taking the hardest, most onerous and hazardous route as an exacting exercise in radical faith. Wow, and then he says, if they were shoved down the more difficult path, it would make it a lot harder to go back to Egypt, to the leeks and onions, because, they'd have to retrack everything. And we could testify in the wilderness that's not something you really want to do.
All right. Well, certainly, it's certainly like when you're in recovery and you've gone through withdrawal, you don't want to have to go through withdrawal again. It is not pleasant. And so that's part of, I think, the pain of withdrawal is part of God's way of saying to you, okay, you don't want to go back into addiction again. You don't want to go back into cycling and addiction again, because then you'll have to go through withdrawal again. And it's one of the ways that mindfulness can be helpful when we're tempted to be drawn back into our addictions, is to remember the pain of withdrawal and say, you know what, I don't think so. I don't want to go through that again. I think I'll just stay clean. I think I can just stay pure and avoid that pain. There's pain one way or the other. There's sometimes pain in doing the right thing, but it's certainly much less pain than that of having to go back through and go through withdrawal again.
So hi guys, for those of you who are just joining us, let's see. Yeah, we've got some comments, but you guys, we can't really see the comments right now because of the angle of the sun. But again, here I could take this way, and then I can see. God led Moses and the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 years until he led them to the Red Sea, where the Israelites were led to what appeared like an impossible situation and delivered in a way God only could deliver. They had to depend on God, and their faith in him was increased. That's from Holly. Yes, Holly, amen. I think what happens is in the wilderness is we have to look to God. Like all of our physical resources are depleted, all of our usual comforts are gone, all of our ways of thinking are changed, all of our coping mechanisms may not be available, all that stuff. And I was thinking about the Israelites going into the desert. I'm guessing, I'm allergic to dust, and so this is kind of a nightmare for me. You see what's happening, honey? It's turning sideways. I think that they're going to get that way. But
Okay, I'll try
if
to
you
fix
can, Dave's going to try to fix the phone. But I started thinking about, were any of the Israelites allergic to dust like I am? You know, did some of them have a broken leg? Were some of them, were their backs out from all the hard labor in Egypt? Did they already have a limp? Possibly, some of them. Obviously, probably some of the women were pregnant. You know, we're talking about a lot of people who probably were going through a lot of different things, and yet here they are being led into the wilderness. Such a risk, such a risky place to go, you know, where they wouldn't eat the same things, where they'd have to rely on God for food, they'd have to rely on each other in new ways, they'd have to rely on leaders in their ways that challenge them to the core, because their trust in leaders had been severely damaged by the time in Egypt and their leaders' inability to get them out. You know, they went in with a lot of trauma in their bones. You know, they went into the wilderness with all this trauma, but yet in God's mind, the wilderness was the perfect place to minister to them in their trauma, the perfect place to show them, to bewilder them, to show him his glory, and to teach them, to recreate them. And so I fear that if we take the wilderness, if we start domesticating discipleship, which is our temptation, right? Make it neat, make it tidy, make it beautiful. Hey, everybody's doing great, everybody's fired up, you know, it's all neat. That we also take the bewilderment out, and we forget, you know, the wild and crazy story of the book of Acts, the wildness of the faith, and how God appears in the wildness and how he transforms us through the wildness. And I think without that addiction journey, addiction, you know, love addiction, sexual addiction, codependency, you know, and all the trauma we've been through, I wouldn't be the woman I am. And maybe I wouldn't even be as gritty as I've become about being in the actual wilderness, because my soul, you know, I go against my mind saying, oh no, you don't want to go back in the wilderness right now. You know, what about your allergies? What about bug bites? What about this? What about that? But yet my soul is like, yes, 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 you need to be wilder. Be in the wilderness in your discipleship. Be in the wilderness for your love for God.
Yeah, I think that common expression is people say, well, at least I have a roof over my head. Something about having a roof over your head gives you a feeling of security and safety. But in the wilderness, God takes the roof out from over your head. And it's a scary thing, but it's a wonderful thing, because when the roof is out from over your head, when you can't go turn on the lights, when you don't have the comfort of a thermostat, when you're out there, it allows you to see God's glory in ways that you just can't see while the roof is over your head. And so you have to leave the comfort of the roof, leave the comfort of the electricity and the lights, leave the comfort of the temperature and the thermostat. But when you do, the payoff is amazing. And nothing like a moonless night under the stars to revive your faith, to encourage your soul, to grasp the vastness and the glory and the majesty and the power of God as you contemplate the universe. You can't experience that with the roof over your head. But when you go into the wild, yes, you give up comfort, but the payoff is unbelievable and is so nourishing to our souls.
Yes, I agree. And even though I got bit, those of you who are just joining us, we're talking about, is God calling you wilder? And grace in the wilderness, or will we choose domesticated discipleship? And even though I got bit by a venomous spider, and it's starting, you know what seemed to be doing the trick is CBD plus colloidal silver finally seems to be calming down all the pain and itching and burning, and the redness seems to be subsiding. You can clearly see the bite on my arm, right on a vein, you know. Yeah, I had another brush with a spider. I didn't see it. I don't know how it happened, but yet we didn't think about leaving. I thought about what resources do we have? You know, what do I have? Dina, what resources do you have? What do we have? And I threw everything at this I had, And I prayed about it. God, help me to relax into this. I don't know why you keep stepping off the edge. Help me to relax into this. Help me to trust it. So is God calling you wilder? Now listen to this. This blew my mind. And again, this is from The Solace of Fierce Landscapes by Belden C. Lane. It says, the Gospel of Mark draws on this same tradition when it speaks of Jesus himself being driven into the desert. The Greek word, how do you pronounce it, honey? Ekbalo?
Ekbalo.
Ekbalo. In Mark, let's see, 1:12, it's funny, is a harsh word having a sense of being roughly thrown or violently propelled. Think about that. That, in other words, the Spirit, when Jesus was driven into the wilderness, and that's, you know, in the English, we kind of domesticate that word. But it really means being roughly thrown or violently propelled. It says Jesus, like all of Israel before him, is forced to take the hard way, going directly from his baptism into the wilderness of temptation. Being thrust into the desert and its promise of death, he sounds in advance the keynote of his whole mission. The Son of God, still wet from the waters of the Jordan, impelled now into the wilds, is going to his death, already headed toward the cross. I mean, I have this sense, I had this picture as I was reading this of Jesus starting into the wilderness and maybe kind of changing his mind, like, I don't know. And then maybe, I know this is just literary, this is just an author thing, but maybe then, now I'm going off the page, that's okay. Yeah, I think I'm there. Anyways, maybe falling down a hill and he's like, Spirit, you want me to go in the wilderness, don't you? You know, like maybe even a little wrestle in going into the wilderness, because there, you know, there'd be no water, no bread, no comforts. And I know Jesus liked food. He seemed to spend a lot of time eating with other people, going to fast, going to be tested. And I always tell people that whenever you surrender something, expect to be tested. In other words, after you surrender, expect wilderness. Expect, you know, that the evil one's going to be there looking to take advantage of, you know, of the wilderness after surrender, you know, where reality hits, of the toughness, of, you know, the challenges that will be tested.
Right. I think wilderness brings out community, and obviously, when you don't have your garage to go get things out of, when you don't have closets, you don't have all the resources you'd have at home, you're more likely to go ask your neighbor, hey, could I borrow an egg? Could I borrow? Because, and that's part of the joy of the wilderness experience, is the community part of it, that you work together, that you find ways to overcome obstacles together in community. Now, obviously, Jesus was out in the wilderness, and in some ways, he got community as well, because the angels actually came and gave him community, and so his dependence on God and the angels was also breathtaking. And I think that's an aspect of the wilderness where we can't rely on ourselves so much. We don't have the ability to store everything we need, and we need to go then and get others involved. And that's one of the other great experiences that comes from being in the wilderness.
Yeah, being in the wilderness of your faith. Again, our topic is God calling you wilder? Grace in the wilderness or domesticated discipleship? Which will you choose? And I fear we've become too domesticated in our discipleship, and that's where we lose our edge. Is that in wanting things to be neat and orderly and follow patterns.
Self-reliant.
We become self-reliant. We forget that other people all around us are having wilderness experiences all the time without the community of body, or without hope, without, you know, so it really drives us. Like, you know, at the campground, if we saw someone hurting, man, we're going to gather all our resources, you know. People holler over like, you know, hey, you guys staying? Hey, what's going on? You know, and we're greeting each other. And Dina went fishing with some other campers this morning.
Some of the walls are torn down.
The walls are torn down. Yeah, and
some of the comments are.
yeah, let's see what people are saying. Let's see. His mercy is like the ocean. Karen, you might consider turning the camera sideways for a wider angle view. Okay. Nicoletto, Jesus was tempted in the wilderness for 40 days in the desert where he experienced temptation. Today I just finished strong the 40-day and Pure the Journey. Oh, awesome. Yeah, Pure the Journey is really a wilderness experience where you go into the wilderness. Belden Lane says basically Jesus invited people into the wilderness over and over again. He didn't, some of his major work wasn't done in cities, in the comfortable places. He drew people out into the desert. It says that people follow him into the desert, curious, captivated, drawn to the edge. In the bright light of day with plenty of company, the wilderness is an adventure, a place for seeking out this strange leader who seems at home on the boundaries. But with the coming of evening, they find themselves out in the desert waste with no resources, far from home. Uneasiness grows. The desert begins to reveal itself for what it is, a place without kindness. The spirit of carnival turns to discomfort, then anxiousness. People confront limits they were reluctant to face. Yet it is here, in the desert of all places, that people are fed, 5,000 of them at a time. Here a new community takes shape, a community formed in brokenness, constituted on the edge. What do you think about that, Dave? A wilderness community is a community formed in our brokenness, not in our strength.
Well, you may not like this, but
I may not. Okay.
I've got to go somewhere here.
Okay. Careful. Okay, careful of our audience. I know we're in the wilderness,
that's
but
right. Well, in the wilderness,
I can't domesticate Dave. That's
right.
For sure. There's no domesticating Dave.
Called pit toilets.
Pit
in
toilets.
The wilderness.
Oh
now,
my gosh.
May not be true wilderness. It may be camping wilderness, but in the world of the pit toilet, there are actually things you can learn. Spiritual realities.
Oh, tell me. I've got to hear this.
Well, at some point you realize that someone knocks on the door and they want to get in after you. And you realize, oh my goodness, I can't flush. I can't spray.
Oh,
What do I do?
Yeah, the wilderness can be smelly, that's for sure.
And then you realize, you know what? We're all pooping in the same hole.
We're exposed.
And nobody can cover up. We're all the same. We're all the same. We've all got stuff, and in the wilderness you just accept that. It's just reality, and you don't worry about it. It's like, oh well, this is what pit toilet living is all about. Yeah. And we just have to accept that we can't hide. We're all the same. We have the same, and it's messy, but you know what? It's okay, and we don't have to be worried or frantic about it. No, we all have the same basic. The Bible says all our temptations are really common.
Yes.
We have so much in common, and we like to, in the domesticated world, we like to hide, we like to spray, we like to cover up any of our imperfections, any of our things that may not smell the best. But in the wilderness, you don't worry about that. Yeah. It's just life, and in some way, it kind of levels the playing field, and it brings us back to our humanity and our sameness. Yeah. We're really all the same in so many ways.
But in the wilderness, you find community, but Holly was saying that we also need isolation, and I so agree. Out there on that paddleboard by myself, just, I could see fishermen way far away, but just by myself, hiking up a mountain where you don't see any other people. There's this sense that God wants to meet me and me alone. And in this bite, I believe, in this venomous spider bite I got, I believe that God meets me there as my source of comfort and grace. And really, that's what Dave and I were talking about, and really the conclusion that Belden Lane reaches is that Met Child of Magdeburg declared love to be the most important of the lessons taught by the wilderness. Isn't that cool? Love is what the wilderness teaches us. To find oneself expended, lost at the end of the trail without hope of return, and to be met there unexpectedly by grace is the soul's deepest longing. Let me read that again. To find oneself expended, lost at the end of the trail without hope of return, and to be met there unexpectedly by grace is the soul's deepest longing. I really believe that in the bite of wilderness, in the bite of sexual addiction and love addiction, in the bite of our weakness, in the bite of our brokenness, in the bite of being somewhere and not figuring out we don't have the resources, we don't know how to deal. You know, the answer isn't to urge each other to get tougher and stronger and better and more spiritual in the way we view it. The answer is grace.
Right. And I believe the wilderness to me is when you define grace as God's affirming presence. That's what calls me into the wilderness, because under the stars, looking at the lake, seeing God's creation and not being choked. The parable of the sower talks about the seed that gets choked by all the cares of life and all the things around us. The wilderness takes away all those things, strips life down to the basics, and puts us in an atmosphere where we can see God so clearly, and our hearts, our faith can be revived, and really what's important becomes really clear. And unfortunately, in a world where we have so many distractions, so many things that can tie up our energy and time and just choke us and obscure God from our view, to me the wilderness is so precious, because I get a chance to get away from the things that choke me and see God in all his glory.
So, is God calling you wilder, grace in the wilderness, or domesticated discipleship? What will you choose? And Karen says, I like the point about God using desert times to lead us to community. Often I retreat into solitude instead in fear of being vulnerable. And I think that's what the wilderness makes us confront, is our vulnerability, our fear of being wounded. You know, our vulnerability is all about wounds.
Yeah.
And having wounds. And I have to say, after I was bit by the spider, I know I keep coming back to that, but that's kind of been my reality, I felt super vulnerable. And the vulnerability was, I was afraid people were going to go, oh, you gotta be kidding, not you again. Why can't you stop getting bit by spiders? You know, come on, Robin, why do you even go out there then? What's up with you? You know, what's wrong with you? Or that there'd be a lack of, oh, there she goes again. Oh, okay, well, what else are we gonna do today? You know, and I guess I feared that people wouldn't think me worthy of comfort in this specific bite, because I'd had so many other bites. And I think that's what we fear in discipleship, isn't it? We're afraid if we have too many bites, we become too much, we press people to the limit, they won't have any more grace for us, they won't have any more patience for us, we're beyond loving. But actually, bites is teaching me just the opposite. You know, Dina was digging through all her supplies. You know, everybody was inspecting it. You know, it's everybody, Dina and her husband, Dave. You know, we're all looking at it. But mainly, as I prayed about it, I felt the great physician there, like saying, you know, what you have is enough. You know, I'm here in this, and it got my attention, and it kind of woke me up, and it made me count the cost, and it made me realize that it's worth it to be vulnerable. And I think that's what we're trying to do in these Facebook Lives. We're turning again. What we're doing in these Facebook Lives, I guess, is just trying to go out on the limb into the wilderness with you guys and find a God that meets you in the wildness of your faith, meets you in the brokenness of your faith.
So, if you find this encouraging, please share it with others. All of our Facebook Lives now are archived on our website. That is purityrestored.com. purityrestored.com. All our Facebook Lives are there. And you'll also find at the bottom on the page there of every page is a place that allows you to donate and to support this ministry as we strive to keep things moving in this COVID situation. We don't have outside sponsors, and so we ask if you can to help support us as we try to bring messages that will be a breath of fresh air and will hopefully support you as you go through your challenges as well.
Do you know people who are wandering in the wilderness? What they need from you probably is your grace. So I hope you'll take that thought with you. Is God calling you wilder? Grace in the wilderness, or domesticated discipleship? Thank you guys for being with us and bearing with our technical difficulties as we've gone along here. It's been a pleasure to be with you from the wilderness. Thank you. How do I?